button. It helps boost this stream in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel, as well as go to the video description where you can find Scott's work, as well as ways to support this channel, Patreon, Substack, and much more. But Scott, let's get started. Maybe we can begin with Ukraine. Since the last time we spoke, the vaunted aid package has been passed. 91 billion for 3 different flashpoints of war, $61 billion earmarked for Ukraine. And as if that wasn't enough, we have, and I'm just going to play this very quickly, we have Vladimir Zelensky reporting that the United States and Ukraine are working out a bilateral security agreement that would be over the course of 10 years. And here's what he had to say.
Also, our teams, Ukraine and the United States, are currently working on a bilateral security agreement, and we are already working on a specific text. Our goal is to make this agreement the strongest of all. We are discussing the specific foundations of our security and cooperation. We are also working on fixing specific levels of support for this year and for the next 10 years, including armed support, financial, political, and joint arms production.
So, Scott, talk about this aid package. How is it going to affect the conflict from here on out, especially given reports even from, I believe it was Alexander Sersky, the new head of the armed forces, the butcher of Bakhmut. He said that there is a retreat happening, actually, in many key points on the front line. So how will this aid change this, or what is your take?
Well, in the short term, this aid won't change anything. As been pointed out by a number of people, including Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and others, Ukraine's real problem right now is a lack of manpower, and no amount of money is going to solve that issue. So, even if the equipment that has been earmarked, I think 13.8 billion of the 60.1 billion is for this military aid, military equipment. Even if all this equipment was released now and it rolled into the front lines now, there's no manpower to man it. The Ukrainians just don't have anybody trained up. They're retreating on the front line, not because of a lack of will to fight, because there's no one left to fight. Brigades that are thrown in suffer attrition, are supposed to be rotated out with fresh brigades, can't be rotated out because there's no fresh brigades. When the Russians break through, brigades that are held in reserve or sent in to counterattack aren't available because they are in the front line elsewhere. And you end up yielding positions that otherwise would have been fought over for weeks. The Ukrainians are yielding them a matter of days. So that's the reality, and there's nothing on the horizon right now that shows that Ukraine's going to be able to resolve this manpower issue anytime soon. There's a desperate need for mobilization taking place, but you don't recruit and train troops overnight. And you're also, Ukraine's behind the 8 ball. In the past, when Ukraine has had to rebuild an army, they've done this several times now. They did it in May and June of 2022, when the bulk of the Ukrainian armed forces were destroyed or neutralized by the Russians during the initial phase of their special military operation. A lot of people are like, oh, the Ukrainians kicked the Russians, but actually the Russians killed a lot of Ukrainians and effectively destroyed their military. And then the Russians voluntarily withdrew from the positions around Kiev and elsewhere as part of a good faith, effort to show the Ukrainians that they were serious about this Istanbul memorandum that they had negotiated for peace, where they said we would leave territory. So Russians were leaving territory to show this good faith. But the Ukrainian army was destroyed. There were units that took 80% casualties that time. They needed to be rebuilt. And so you get this $46 billion new what's the World War II Lend-Lease agreement. And over the course of the summer, the United States, NATO, and other European nations rebuilt the Ukrainian army, infused 60 to 80,000 men trained in Germany, trained in Poland and elsewhere, along with equipment. And the Ukrainians were able to carry out a counteroffensive against a depleted Russian force that had already started withdrawing from the Kharkov area. I mean, that's the irony of it. Everybody's like, the Ukrainians recaptured. The Russians were leaving. They told the Ukrainians, we're leaving. And half the guys had already left. And so these were undermanned. The Ukrainians attack and the Russians fall back to their, the positions they were going to, and those hold. That Ukrainian army was largely destroyed in carrying out this operation. And so they rebuilt the Ukrainian army again, $22 billion thrown into it. They rebuilt it for the great counteroffensive. The bulk of this army was destroyed during the battles of Bakhmut, where, they threw forces in, and people were telling them, don't commit to Bakhmut, just give it to the Russians. Don't waste your troops. Nope. They ground up 60,000 there. Then they ground up another 61,000 or so in their failed counterattack. A total of 160,000 troops were lost. And now they've got nothing left. There's nobody left to rebuild. There's no troops in training. There's nothing. There's no reservoir to draw upon. And yet the Russians now are putting more and more troops. Russians have said that they've rebuilt, mobilized 2 combined arms armies and what they call the Dnieper River Flotilla, which is a division-sized force designed to secure the Dnieper River. These guys have already been recruited and trained. You have Colonel General Lapin re-emerging on the battlefild. He's a general that fought with great heroics early on in the fighting. He was relieved, under a cloud. I guess he had a difference of opinion with General Surovikin. Sent back, went to the General Staff Academy. They deemed him to be fit for command, and they put him in charge of 100,000 Russians who are now appearing on the front line, ready to commit. This is an offensive-minded general. So, the bottom line is the Ukrainians are on their back heels and backing up further. The second and third lines of defense have been penetrated by the Russians. Ukrainians don't seem to have the ability to plug these gaps. And eventually what's going to happen is they're going to have to make a precipitous withdrawal across the entire breadth. And this is something Ukrainians don't want to do, because there are still cities that they're holding, towns they're holding in Donetsk that are strong points, heavily fortified, have been fortified for over a decade. And, the Russians haven't made any progress there. And the Ukrainians are loath to give up these fortified positions because they think at a minimum they should force the Russians to pay, a heavy price to take these. But as Russia penetrates the line and starts maneuvering around, these places run the risk of being surrounded. And then the Ukrainians will have no choice but to withdraw from that. And this is what we're starting to see as the Russians shape the battlefield. The equipment that they're going to get, some of it, everybody's talking about the ATACMS missile. Well, the ATACMS missile has been introduced to this battlefield since March. The Biden administration admits that without congressional approval, they went ahead and gave these missiles to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have been using them since March. And they continue to use them now, and with some success. But the Russians jam the GPS, guidance system. The Russians shoot down the majority of the ATACMS that are shot. It's not a game-changing weapon. There's no such thing as a game-changing weapon. This 60 like I said, 60.1 billion, but only 13.8 is for military assistance. The rest goes to other things, including getting the United States to rebuild equipment, and that's going to take over, several years. A lot of this equipment isn't available right now. It has to be procured. It has to be assembled. It's going to unfold over a series of months, and Ukraine doesn't have months. They're running out of time now. And I think you're just going to see the battlefield continue to deteriorate to the detriment of the Ukrainian strategic posture. And there's nothing that the Ukraine could do to stop that.
Yeah, and talk about this retreat that's going on, because Sierski is making it seem like it's tactical, like there's a almost like a directive for this retreat to occur. Yet there are reports also that there's been spotted many Ukrainian troops just running away from the front lines, and even in terms of manpower, there have been Azov fighters who have reported that nobody wants to go. Like not even Azov fighters want to go to the front line, and these are the forces that have been the people that you talk a lot about, Scott, the Banderas, who are so passionate about this cause to supposedly defeat Russia. So can you talk about this retreat that's happening, especially in Donetsk? You said it's heavily fortified. A lot of the reports about the retreat have also been from that location, that very important location, of course, for Russia.
When we, first of all, let's just make it clear when we talk about retreating Ukrainians. I haven't met a Russian officer or soldier yet who will speak disparagingly about the Ukrainians as fighters. Every Russian I've met who's been on the front line speaks very highly of the Ukrainians. They don't agree with their politics. They're actively trying to kill them, but they, to a man, they say these guys fight hard. The Ukrainians fight hard because they're Russians. I mean, for the most part, they're the same people. They're loath to surrender. They fight to the last bullet. They sometimes fight to the last man. They don't want to give up positions. So when a Ukrainian retreats, it means that the situation's really, really gone bad. It takes a lot to get the Ukrainian to retreat. So the mere fact that we're talking about a withdrawal means that the situation has deteriorated, in a horrific manner for the Ukrainians. The way they call this positional warfare. First of all, the amount of artillery and the amount of the mines and anti-tank weapons make, the traditional large-scale massed attacks impractical. So this battlefield, this war, has turned into basically just a series of raids conducted by one another. Smaller groupings of infantry backed up by limited numbers of armor, trying to carry out very limited objectives. For instance, securing the next tree line, securing a couple buildings in a village, and then once you secure it, to dig in and then see what the Ukrainians do. Generally, what happens is the Ukrainians will counterattack, and at some point in time, the attacking forces, rather than die, will withdraw. And then the next day, they'll do it all over again. And the idea is that you continue to do that till one side gets exhausted. If the Russians get exhausted, they stop attacking and the line freezes on that. If the Ukrainians get exhausted, the Russians end up taking that corner of the village or that tree line, but now they're exhausted. So they stop, they take a pause, the line solidifies, and they do it again. Now that we have drones, it becomes even more complicated because each side is flooding the zone with drones, which makes the concentration of troops and equipment suicidal. If a drone operator sees 5 guys together, the drone dives in and gets them. And so you're seeing people disperse. You're operating in groups of 2 men, 3 men, smaller groups. That's the way modern battlefields have come in. You don't see large groupings of troops together because that's an invitation to die. And so this battlefield is like that. These groups, these limited attacks, duration attacks. The other thing is, because of drones and artillery, you can't assemble the artillery. For instance, if I was going to put artillery fires in support of an advance, I would bring up my artillery shells sufficient to the task. And then I would have them there. I can fire them off. But nowadays, if I bring up the artillery shells, that damn drone spots it. And now I have a lot of ammo there, and they're going to start firing, hoping to set off my ammunition dump. And when they set off my ammunition dump, my offensive stalls because I no longer have the artillery able to support it. So what instead I do is, instead of looking for the grand breakthrough, etc., I bring up the artillery necessary for very limited advances. That way, I don't suffer overwhelming losses if they get my artillery piece, my artillery ammunition. And it also makes it more difficult for the enemy to see. So everything gets broken down into smaller packets, and the war, still extremely violent, instead of being one large overarching battle, becomes a series of very small engagements all along the front line. Each engagement is life and death for the people participating, but this is the way the war has gone. And that's why it's attritional as opposed to positional, because you're not taking a large amount of territory. The reason why I bring this up is that for Syrskyi to start talking about withdrawals, retreats, that's a deviation. That means that the Ukrainians can no longer maintain that kind of contact, that they have insufficient forces, that as the Russians advance and take a tree line, the Ukrainians can't counterattack. But worse than that, the Ukrainians don't even have troops to fall back on the next line of defense. And so the Russians take the next tree line, then the next tree line. Suddenly they're through the second defensive line into a village, moving up a ridge line. And again, it's all slower because as bad as things are for the Ukrainians, they still have artillery. They still have FPVs. They don't have an overwhelming amount of artillery, but if you give them a target, they're going to hit your target. They're going to take you out. So the Russians are not massing their troops. They're still going very gradual offenses. But as it unfolds, the Ukrainians, they're not stupid, are doing the military math saying the Russians have outflanked us here. We don't have the artillery fire or the troops to commit to this fight to stop this. So we have no choice now. If we don't want to lose these troops down here, we already have a manpower shortage, so we can't throw away troops. We're going to have to start withdrawing troops to basically consolidate the lines. If you have a line that's, like this, if you have a straight line, it takes less forces to deploy along that straight line. As soon as you start throwing curves, you have more area, and so you have to deploy more forces. So sometimes to hold, this section of ground, it takes twice as many troops because you've got curves in the line. And so what will happen sometimes when you need to conserve forces, you need to fall back so that you remove the bulges, remove the curves, straighten out the line. And then your troops now can get the appropriate concentrations. And the Ukrainians right now are looking at this line that the Russians are turning into this big curvy mess that the Russians are able to man, but the Ukrainians can't. And Syrski's talking about a tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions. The problem, though, is that, well, it may look like a tactical withdrawal. If once they get to those new defenses, they don't have the ability to freeze the battle there and hold the Russians at bay, they're going to have to withdraw again. And suddenly, if you've done a series of tactical withdrawals, it starts to look like a strategic withdrawal. And I think we're right now in the initial part of what I believe will be a series of tactical withdrawals, in effect, a strategic withdrawal. And that's what we're looking at. The Russians have hinted to me that something big is going to happen that's going to dramatically change the map of the battlefield. And I think what you're going to be looking at is that the Russians are going to start to make major gains in recovering the totality of the Donbass, recovering the Zaporizhia, threatening Kharkov. You're going to start seeing that. And then once that happens and they get on the Dnieper River, the Russians can consolidate their lines, a reconcentration of troops, Mykolaiv, the rest of Kherson, Odessa. And I think this is what we're going to be seeing through the summer. If Syrski wants to call that tactical withdrawal, so be it. It looks like a strategic retreat to me.
Yeah, well, maybe you can speak to then, given that this feels like dominoes are kind of falling and Russia is methodically pushing the dominoes over when it comes to Ukraine, what will then 10 years, now Zelensky and the United States are supposedly in these talks for a 10-year bilateral security agreement. What could this possibly accomplish, given that the situation right now is looking very grim? The aid that has been pushed through is likely not going to change anything or even prolong the situation further to a certain degree. So what will this accomplish then if the United States and Ukraine come to some kind of 10-year bilateral security agreement?
Well, let's keep in mind that this past security agreement was passed by Congress in the fall, and it was supposed to be dispersed in the fall. Excuse me. And we are, coming up on 6 months later, and it's cost Ukraine dearly. It was held hostage by American politics, by presidential politics, to be precise. The border security became an issue, and the Republicans in the Congress hijacked this supplemental funding package, saying that they weren't going to release money for Ukraine, for Taiwan, for Israel, without money also being allocated to the security of the southern border. And The Democrats were saying, well, we already have a good border plan. They didn't want to admit defeat, so it became a political problem, and the money was held hostage until the Iranians and Israelis changed the dynamic of the discussion with their tit-for-tat retaliatory potential expanding to a greater war issue. And suddenly, from a political perspective, in order to assuage Israel, to keep Israel from launching a major attack against Iran that could trigger an Iranian counter response and then a war, we needed to release this money. And so Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, broke the supplemental up into its various components. These components were voted on single and then brought back together and passed. But it was only because of domestic politics, because of a change in the foreign policy calculus that suddenly said, we have to get that Israeli money out. But you couldn't have the Israeli money linked to the Ukrainian money or the Taiwanese money. It had to be voted on Israel. Once you took the Israeli money out, you might as well split the stuff up. Mike Johnson's reasoning, and it happened. They voted on it. They all three passed by good majorities, and now the money is there. But now you're Ukrainian, and you're also the Biden administration. Look, the Biden administration has to be realistic at this point in time. There's a chance that Biden isn't going to be reelected, but even if he is, it would be for 4 years, and and he'll be challenged. The Democrats will be challenged at the end of the 4 years. It's going to be very tough. You're either going to get a Republican presidency this time around, or you're going to get a Republican presidency 4 years from now. Now, do you want to admit that Ukraine has been defeated, that this is the last supplemental that's been passed? There will be no more supplementals. You can't do that. But do you also want future supplementals to be held hostage by domestic American presidential politics? Because no matter what, as soon as this election's over in November, we're going to immediately jump into, looking to 2028, and and things, we're talking about a whole new set of political players. We don't know how Congress is going to react, et cetera. So what the Biden administration is trying to tell Zelensky and the Europeans, because a lot of this is about mollifying European concerns who watched $61 billion be held up and Europe sort of left standing alone. The idea is to have a 10-year commitment that would be very difficult, if not impossible, for a president to overturn. It allows for predictability. It allows for sustainability. But the whole idea is to remove American domestic politics from the equation so that we don't have a situation going down where the United States Congress holds military aid for Ukraine hostage. Now, this is all fine and dandy. I mean, it's nice to live in a fantasy world. And Zelensky and anybody in the Biden administration that's talking about this is living in a fantasy world, one that assumes that Ukraine is going to survive the summer, and that Ukraine will be in a position going forward to continue, meaningful resistance against the Russians. But they tend to forget that I know they hold peace conferences in Switzerland where they don't invite the Russians, and so the world's become accustomed to talking about things that deal with the Russians without actually having the Russians involved. But the reality is, the Russians alone will determine when this war ends and how this war ends and under what conditions. Not Zelensky, not the president. So they can sign whatever agreements they want. First of all, there's no guarantee the U.S. Congress will go along with this. I mean, does Congress really want to abrogate its responsibilities of oversight and give the executive branch, and not just this executive branch, but to be holding other executive branches hostage to an agreement that they can't overturn? That's the intent. I don't see Congress doing this. So I think right now what we have is a lot of political posturing to assuage Zelensky, and then Zelensky, like the idiot that he is, goes out and makes this public in an effort to put pressure on the United States. Now I've made it public, therefore you can't back away. I think that the supplemental funding for Ukraine going forward, if it goes forward, will continue to be heavily politicized. It'll be very difficult to get this money out of the U.S. Congress. But more importantly, I just think that the situation on the battlefield is going to so dramatically be altered over the course of the summer that no one's going to be talking about a supplemental package for Ukraine this time next year, because I'm pretty sure that this problem will have been resolved, that there won't be a Ukraine, or it will exist under the wings of Russia.
Yes, and perhaps we can transition to this topic you mentioned, the manpower issue, and something I've noticed whenever I'm reading mainstream media. The Washington Post actually had a pretty, the most detailed report I think I've seen about manpower issues and Ukraine. But even then, even still, even though they have a Ukrainian anonymous Ukrainian lawmaker say that the 30,000 or so Ukrainian troops that have been killed, that have been reported killed since 2022, even though they said it's a massive undercount, still the Washington Post fails to deliver any kind of estimate. But they are very quick to say that Russia has lost, and this, kind of boggles my mind when I hear this number, 300,000 troops, and they still push this narrative that Russia's military is in trouble. So how did Russia, this is an admission, Washington Post has admitted that Ukraine's manpower issue is a very real one and a very dire one. How did this happen? How was Russia able to accomplish this? And as you said that you had a tip that things are really going to change. How does this issue affect these developments regarding Russia's progress?
Well, the casualties are very closely held numbers for both sides, and the main reason is because of politics. General Christopher Cavoli, he was the commander of U.S. forces in Europe and the commander of NATO ground forces back in January, February of 2023, he was speaking at a defense forum in Sweden, I believe, and he said that the scope and scale of the violence that's taking place on the battlefield in Ukraine is beyond the imagination of NATO, beyond anything in NATO could possibly have imagined. It's the job of military organizations like NATO to imagine things, because that's how you plan the next war. You imagine what it's going to look like so that you have sufficient forces who are organized properly and equipped properly. If I finish World War II with a victorious army, and I say, we're victorious, my army's not going to change. And meanwhile, the world develops jet airplanes, nuclear bombs, but I stay the same, that army's not going to function very well on the battlefield. You have to have people not only preparing for what they know is going on, but you have to have somebody saying, hey, what's the battlefield going to look like in 2 years, in 5 years? What do I need to do to prepare for that? What kind of weapon systems do I need? How do I need to restructure my army? Do I want to stay in a triad system? Do I want to go to a square system? How many, is this the right level of manpower? Do I want an 11-man squad? Do I want to go to a 12-man squad, a 15-man squad? Do I want my fire teams to be 3, 5, 7? Things like this, that because how you structure it now is how you recruit for it, how you train for it, how you procure for it. All of this requires imagination. And what Cavoli said is NATO hadn't imagined it. Now, this is a huge concession and admission, because what he's saying is NATO's not ready for this kind of fight, that NATO's not organized for it, they're not trained for it, they're not equipped for it. They don't have the logistics for this. They can't sustain this level of fighting. So, when you have NATO drawing a blank like that, Danny, you got to forgive me. I'm very tired, and I was so into Christopher Cavoli that I forgot the question. You've got to remind me.
No worries. The question was about this manpower issue. How did Russia get to this point where
I'm
now
back
we are talking? Yeah. We are.
I'm on it now.
Got it.
I was there, and I don't know if you saw my mind at one point in time. I'm just there going,
You were talking about NATO.
I had Cavoli down, and then I'm like trying to get back to the gist of the argument, and it's going, what are we talking about? I can't remember.
No worries.
Manpower. Got it. It's been a long day. But so on Ukraine, so first of all, the level of violence is beyond what anybody could possibly imagine. Danny, tell me what you want with this manpower question.
Yeah, no. How did Russia get here to the point where now there's
Okay,
all this talk about
casualties. That's it. Well, first of all, understand that 31,000 figure is just absolute crap. The Russians are saying, and the Russians are running very conservative numbers. The Russians are talking about Ukrainian casualties, in close to 400,000. But the fact of the matter is that's a gross undercounting. There's every reason to believe that the Ukrainians have suffered closer to 500,000 dead, and on top of that, you can add, 1 million plus wounded. It's a massive number. This is why the Ukrainians have the manpower shortage that they have, is that they've eaten through. When they started this, I always remember people, Ritter, you're making these numbers up. When they started the war, the Ukrainians had like 250,000, 260,000 regular forces, heavily armed, heavily trained, ready. They had border guards and other reserves that were another 300,000. Then they had, in the area of 400, 500,000 territorials. These are more a different kind of reserve, sort of like the National Guard. But all in total, roughly somewhat less than 1 million men that were fighting. That's a lot. Those are gone. Where did 1 million men go? And remember, they've been recruiting and training. They're in they're in multiples of mobilizations that have taken place. And the point is that the battlefield is just grinding them up. Now, Vladimir Putin a while back talked about 10-to-1 casualty ratios. And the reason why it's important is that the Russians don't talk about their casualties, and they don't like people talking about their casualties. But let's just say that if you've suffered 500,000 dead, and it's 10-to-1, that means the Russians have suffered 50,000 dead. But Putin isn't going to commit to a ratio that isn't related to the official numbers that the Russians are putting out. So if Russia is saying that they're counting, 400,000 Ukrainian casualties, and Putin is committing to a 10-to-1 casualty ratio, then we're looking at about 40,000 Russian casualties. That's probably dead. That's a lot of dead, but that's probably what we're talking about. Which means that if you go with a 2 or 3-to-1 wounded to dead ratio, 4, 8, 12, 16, you're talking about between 120 and 160,000 Russian casualties. Russia started this war with about 180 to 200,000 troops in theater. Now, since that time, they did a partial mobilization, 300,000. And then they brought in waves of volunteers, and the volunteers ended up numbering over 400,000. So if you've got, let's say, 200,000 plus 300, that's 500,000, plus another 450, you're up to 950,000 minus 180, 750, 670,000. I think that's the number people are talking about of Russian troops in theater before this most recent thing, because Russia's, what's happening now is that they're getting 30 to 40,000 volunteers a month. Just to put this in perspective, the U.S. Army, which is 425,000 strong, had a recruiting goal of 60,000 2 years ago, and they could only get 45,000 people to sign up, so they're 15,000 short of 425. And the people who are supposed to imagine, they're saying, in order for us to do this kind of warfare in Europe and talk about Europe, we need to expand the U.S. Army by 150 to 200,000 men. We can't maintain the current levels. We tried to recruit 60,000 just to maintain the current levels. We were 15,000 short. The next year, we put the number up to 65,000 because we had now an emergency shortfall, and we were 10,000 short. We only got 50,000. So the end result is the U.S. Army had to reduce, I think, 24,000 billets. That means when you look at the table of organization, they had to go around and eliminate 24,000 jobs in the U.S. Army and say these jobs are no longer going to be filled. We're not going to recruit to these jobs because Congress authorizes an official strength. That official strength is based upon a table of organization. The table of organization lists every unit and every job in that unit. That's how we determine what kind of schools we need, because every job has a specialty. That specialty has to be attached to training requirements that go to schools. The schools are related, to equipment that's being procured. We're training people to fix this equipment. We need equipment for this. All this is done by a giant chart. And what the Army had to do is say, we got to go to that chart and reduce it by 24,000 because we don't have the manpower to do it. At a time when they're being told to fight with the Russians, you need to expand by 200,000. We can't recruit to what we're doing. The Russians, on the other hand, have a situation where 30 to 40,000 men are volunteering a month to join the Russian military. And they're training these people. So the 100,000 troops that are getting ready to come into the theater is on top of the 670 that are there right now. And this 670 is staying rather static. If you take a look at the casualty figures, the Russians today are suffering some of the lowest casualty rates that they've suffered for the entire war, meaning the Ukrainians aren't killing that many Russians anymore. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian numbers are spiking. The Russians are killing 800, 900, 1,000 Ukrainians a day. Now, Putin's 10-to-1 thing means Russia's losing 80, 90, 100 guys a day, but they're not. They're losing 50 guys a day. Now, that's a lot. Let me just put it in perspective. Again, in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, at the height of the Vietnam War, we were bringing home 200, 220 body bags a week. And it broke America. If the Russians are at their lowest casualty rate of the war and they're losing 50 guys a day, I'm just a simple Marine, but 50 times 7 days in a week, that's 350 body bags. That's more than we brought home during the Vietnam War, which broke our soul. Imagine Russia, a nation of 150 million, getting 350 body bags a week, or basically zinc coffins a week. And that's a good week. That's a week where they went, whew, we could have lost so much more. That's the reality. But so this is a bloody war. I don't want to pretend that it's not, but the Russians aren't suffering the casualties. And the other thing is, for all the casualties they suffer, they're being replenished. Again, I'm just a simple Marine, but 350 dead a week. Let's go to a 3-to-1 casualty ratio. That's 1,050, 350. We'll call it 1,400 casualties a week. In a month, 4 weeks in a month, that'll be 4,000, and then 4, 8, 12, 16, 5,600 casualties a month. So the Russian order of battle is being subtracted 5,600 casualties a month. Normally that would break you. I mean, that's a lot. They're getting 40,000 volunteers a month. So they're losing 5,600, but they're getting 40,000, which means they're gaining 34,400 a month. They're getting stronger every month by a significant number. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are losing, let's call it low figure, 800 guys a day. Now, they're not as efficient in their removal. The reason why their casualty rate's so high is they can't evacuate wounded. So let's call it 2-to-1, 1,600, 8, 2,400 times 7. We're getting into big numbers right now, times 4, even bigger numbers. Too big for this simple Marine calculator to do off the top of my head, but you're losing a whole bunch of guys and they're getting nobody. They're getting a handful of people coming in. So they're just getting weaker and weaker every day. And they can't reverse this. Sometimes a problem, they always talk about, you don't want to let a problem get to the point where it overwhelms you. Because once it does that, you can't solve the problem. You're just overwhelmed and you can't halt it. It's just going to fall apart. That's where the Ukrainians are right now on manpower. It's gotten to the point where they literally, there's nothing they can do to resolve this problem. Whereas the Russians are just an overwhelming, they're getting 100,000 more guys fully trained. Behind that 100,000 is 100,000 more and 100,000 more and 100,000 more. And they're being equipped with the best equipment. The Russians are pumping out 150, 200 tanks a month. The United States can produce 44 a month surge, not new production, refurbished. The Germans can produce about 150 a year if they have the steel, but they don't have the steel anymore because their steel plants have shut down because of the sanctions. So they can't even produce the tanks anymore because there's no steel to produce them. The same thing with the French. They can produce about 100 Leclerc tanks a year. If they have the steel and the orders, they don't. The bottom line is the Russians produce more tanks in a month than NATO produces in a year. And the Russians, we talk about the problem with the Americans. The Russian army started off, this conflict, 900,000. Last year, in response to NATO expansion, Vladimir Putin authorized the Russian military to be expanded to 1.5 million. Now, some of that expansion would be done by increasing the number of conscripts. So what we saw is that, from, let's say, 125,000 conscripts per, Russia runs 2 conscription cycles per year. The number's gone up to around 150,000. So of the number that the Russians need, they're looking for about 50,000 from additional bodies from the conscripts. The rest of them, contract soldiers, which they're getting right now with the volunteers. 1.5 million. Last time the Russians reported, they said they've got it up. They've successfully brought this up to around 1.35 million. That's 1,350,000. And they're moving to get to the 0.5. But this doesn't include, and this is the thing that people need to understand, when we talk about the size of the Russian army, even that 670,000, it doesn't include a lot of the volunteer units. It doesn't include units like the Russian Guard, the Akhmat, the Chechen units, special volunteer units, BARS units, things of this nature. Some of the LNR units, some of the DNR, Lugansk, the Donetsk. These are units and structures outside of the Ministry of Defense. Wagner, big news. Abdi Aladanov, the commander of the first Guard Corps, Army Guard Corps in Lugansk, the Akhmat Sila Chechen commander, just inked a contract with Rabator, famous Wagner commander of the first assault group, the man who raised the flag over Soledar, the man who raised the flag over Bakhmut. Robitar and 3,000 Wagner fighters, some of the best veterans in the Wagner organization, have signed a contract and they've joined the Russian Guard, and they're part of the Akhmat forces with Abdi Aladanov. These guys aren't part of that 670,000. So Russia's got close to 1 million people in this area, in this theater of operations, and they're getting ready to bring in another 100,000 with another 100,000, another 100,000. By the time the middle of the summer comes, Russia is going to have about 1.2, 1.3 million men committed to this fight. And that's all she wrote for the Ukrainians, because at this point in time, the Russians will be able to saturate the front line. The Ukrainians can't stop, and the Russians are just going to roll over and swamp them. And I think that's the direction this is going. But again, let's never forget, and the Russians will never let you forget, that the Ukrainian is one hell of a fighter. And they will fight hard for every square inch of territory. And if they are given equipment and they have the manpower to use the equipment, they'll use the equipment with lethality. So this isn't going to be a pushover. And I always tell people, when we talk about World War II and the American forces in Germany, the bloodiest month of the war for the United States Army wasn't June 1944, D-Day. It wasn't December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. It was April 1945, the last full month of the war. Germany was defeated. There was no chance for Germany to win. And yet this defeated German army, because it was fighting desperately on German soil, killed more Americans the month of April than any other month of the war. So we have to keep in mind that no matter what you say about the Ukrainians and the collapsing, anybody that expects the fighting to stop, you don't know the Ukrainians. The Russians know the Ukrainians, and they respect the Ukrainians.
It's an interesting paradox or contradiction, maybe. And maybe if you could briefly speak to, on the one hand, you have Russians just joining this cause to really eye-popping numbers that you put out there, and it speaks to how much, I know you've spoken on other programs in the past about why Russia and Russians in particular are so passionate about this particular cause. But then you also have Ukrainians. On the one hand, the manpower issue is a product of war. It's a product of Russia being very successful in war. And you also have now seemingly many more reports of Ukrainians, because of how bad it is, fleeing. But you also have, as you said, Ukrainians also very committed to their side of this cause. Could you explain why, first, maybe on the Russian side? We've talked a lot about Ukraine and why Ukraine is fighting this conflict. But on the Russian side, like, why is this so critical? Why have Russians, I know you've been to Russia several times, why have Russians really stepped up for this cause to the point where it's it's almost absolutely essential that you're part of it in some form?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, but in order to give an answer, I got to forgive me, because I'm going to give you an expansive answer, because it's the only way I can answer the question properly. Russia, you have to go back to the 1990s to understand how to answer this question. In the decade of the 90s, and the chaos and the catastrophe that took place, millions of Russians dying, the economic catastrophe, the political catastrophe, every aspect of Russian society was in a state of decay and collapse. This is the Russia that Vladimir Putin inherited. It was a thoroughly diseased Russia. And it was one that was a political minefield. I mean, people need to go back and read about the last months of the Yeltsin regime and how the wolves were circling with the knives to carve it all up when Yeltsin went away. He had all the people that thought they were going to be the heir apparent. And that's why he reached out and he grabbed Putin and brought him in, because Yeltsin knew at the end, he apologized. In his farewell address, I made many mistakes, he said. And he recognized that. And one of the mistakes he made was to entrust too much to his wife and to his daughter and his daughter's husband. And they had assembled this pack of wolves that are getting ready to continue to devour people who enriched themselves from the collapse and demise of Russia. So he brought in Putin and he put Putin in charge. Everybody today is like, Putin's this all-powerful leader and all that stuff. Hey, you can say what you want. He was in a precarious situation, and he had to make compromises. He had to make, decisions about what his priorities were to right this sinking ship, which means he had to tolerate a lot of stuff. And what he had to tolerate was the corruption of the oligarchs. Now, he told the oligarchs early on, do not get involved in politics. I need you guys to keep doing your economic thing. I'm going to tell you right now that your economic thing, while you get rich, needs to also start having money come back into Russia and bringing the life, the quality of life up for Russians. But if you get involved in politics, and Khodorkovsky, the head of Gazprom, I guess, or Lukoil, I think it was, he said, screw you, Putin, who the hell are you coming in here at the last second to take over what I was supposed to be running? And he jumped into politics. Putin took him down, arrested him, put him in jail, ended up getting exiled. He's one of the leaders of the opposition right now, and operating out of London. But you have this oligarch problem. You have also the problem of the integration of the West. The West had come in during the 90s. Companies had been installed. They'd become insinuated with the Russian social and economic and political fabric. So you had about 30 to 40% of Russia entwined with the West, and you couldn't do anything to clean that up. Because remember, it's a democracy. Putin has to run for elections, and he needs to win them. And he was, it's not Saddam Hussein dictatorship where you get, 99.99%, or Kim Jong-un gets 100% because he's Kim Jong-un. No, Putin had to run against people who were gunning for his job, against a very large opposition, well funded by the West. So he's getting 54, 56, 58%, which is a nice margin. But if he alienates what was a politically neutral, pro-Western element who said, as long as you allow the economy to function so that we can put money in our pocket, money in the bank, and we can live okay, we'll keep supporting you for, in office. Well, he also understood that this system right here was inefficient. It fed the corruption of the oligarchs and all that, but he couldn't touch it. Compromises had to be made. Also, in Yeltsin, the time of the governors, under Yeltsin, they all became corrupt. The entire system was corrupt. Putin couldn't come in and shock the whole system at once. He had to basically make compromises to allow certain practices to continue while he started cleaning up office. And while he's cleaning up office, he has to solve a war in Chechnya, sit down with Ahmed Kadyrov and bring an end to that conflict to resolve the Chechen situation. While he's doing that, he has, other situations coming up. The United States trying to use Navalny to create a color revolution in the streets. He has to leave and turn power over to Medvedev while the United States seeks to use Medvedev to keep Putin out of office, tearing down democracy. So instead of being able to be totally focused on the rebuilding of Russia, he continually has to make his priorities about the survival of Russia, which requires compromises to be made about corruption, about certain political practices, certain things that otherwise wouldn't be tolerated, but have to be tolerated. And so this is the situation of Russia. It's moving in the right direction. Putin is doing a great job of reviving it, but it's still fundamentally, it's still got a disease. It's like having a cancer still inside you, but you've suppressed the symptoms. It looks like you're healthy, but it's still there. It hasn't gone into remission, and it's going to come back if you don't deal with it, but you can't deal with it because you got to solve all these other issues out there. And that's the situation that existed in Russia at the time of the initiation of the special military operation. Putin was very worried, according to press reports. There was these sanctions. They had no idea how these sanctions were going to impact. He was being told by his top experts that the Western sanctions were going to cause a contraction in the economy of 25-30%. That's very hard. And now you have people saying you don't have enough manpower, especially after the Ukrainians counterattack. But how do you mobilize? If you mobilize at a time when the economy was going into a shock, you could get even a greater shock. And now that shock creates people who have no jobs, who are looking at the collapse of the economy. That Western elite that was ingrained with the West will rebel. Putin's in a very precarious situation. But then things happened. The economy didn't shrink. The economy, it shrunk, but a small percentage, and it looked like it was going to grow. That gave him great latitude now to say, with a healthy economy, I can do things. The West sanctioned the oligarchs. That was the end of the oligarch class. Solved one of Putin's forever problems. He doesn't have to worry about the oligarchs anymore. The West sanctioned them, and overnight, the oligarchs became a political nullity. Putin said, get the hell out of the country. We don't need you anymore. And those that stay because of sanctions, you can't take your wealth out. And now Putin gets to solve another problem: how to get that money reinvested back into Russia. Laws are passed, the money's reinvested. And when it gets reinvested, Putin takes control of that. And now the corruption's real. And suddenly you've got this great thing. Then the West, by the sanctions, they divorce with Russia economically. And that whole group that was entwined there that Putin had to worry about, doesn't have to worry about them anymore because the divorce has happened, but it's not Putin's fault. It's the West's fault. And these people start going, who's to blame? The West is to blame. And literally overnight, what happened is the Russians woke up to the reality that the West was trying to kill them, that the West wanted to destroy Russia, and they rediscovered patriotism. Now, the Russians have always been patriotic, but they've been sort of confused patriots because the Russians, especially after the 1990s, looked to the West as sort of, the big Western brother, etc. But now Russians are going, well, no, the West, and they're looking in the mirror going, I'm not as ugly as I thought I was. I'm doing all right. I go to the gym a little bit. I can fix this. I can fix this. And then they go to the gym and they're going, I look pretty damn good. I can compete. They're working. They're getting money. Their economy's doing well. And the Russians become proud of being Russian again. And that's what's happening here. You have people now that are proud to be Russian. They are proud to say, I am Russian. And there's a surge of patriotism, and it is as real as it gets. And this results in two things. One, the Russians now saying that this war in Ukraine is their equivalent to the Great Patriotic War. This is an existential fight for the survival of Russia. And the Russians have rediscovered patriotism, and they are saying we are committed to victory here. We are not going to be defeated here. We are 100% behind this presidency. Then you had an election that took place last month. And the interesting thing about this election is everybody knew that Putin was going to win. But the goal was to have Russians be so upset about the war, about the economy, that they wouldn't show up in numbers. And the people did show up. Putin would win by a not so impressive margin. But Putin took the case of Russian patriotism to the Russian people. And he said, this election isn't about me. It's It's about you. It's about us. It's about the Russian nation. And they responded. 77% of the Russian people went to the polls, and 88% of those who went to the polls voted for Vladimir Putin. And now on May 7th, you're going to see something that's amazing, the inauguration. After that inauguration, Putin's going to complete the task of cleaning Russia up. All of those little residual corruptions, those little inefficiencies that he had to make compromises about to sustain because he couldn't take the political risk to go after them, he's going to go after them because the Russian people are behind him. And here's the lesson. In a time of war, when the Russian people are being asked to make so much sacrifice, in America, we talk about the military-industrial complex, but do we really elevate them? I mean, we talk about it sort of critically. Do we elevate them to the same status as the soldiers on the front line? No. In Russia, in the city of Magnitogorsk, there's a monument called the Home Front, and it's about World War II. But there's a Red Army soldier and a Russian worker, and they're holding aloft a sword that's made from the steel that's produced at the factory. From the sword is being presented from the worker to the Red Army soldier. The Red Army soldier takes that sword and gives it to Mother Russia, and at Volgograd, the motherland beckons. She is calling Russia forward, holding that sword aloft. That sword is in the hands of the Russian soldier in the Berlin Monument on the ground while he holds a child in his arm. The war is over, and that sword is at the United Nations being turned into a plow. The Russian people identify with everything I just said. They understand the continuity there. So when you talk to the Russian people, it's not just about the troops at the front line. It's about the nation supporting this conflict. This is a national call to war. Corruption is not tolerated right now. This is where Putin can take advantage of this, because right now there is a zero level of corruption tolerance in Russia today because of the war, because of the sacrifice that everybody's being asked to make for the war, for this existential struggle. And starting on May 7th, Putin is going to clean house. It's going to be a completely different Russia. It's a Russia that's positioning itself for the post-Putin era. And it couldn't have happened. This is the irony of it, Danny. None of this could have happened if it weren't for the stupidity of the West. If the West wanted to destroy Russia, really, I mean, they never asked me, and I wouldn't have advised this because I believe in being friends with Russia. But somebody came up to me and said, Scott, the United States isn't going to be friends with Russia. But we need your advice. You're an American. How would you advise us to go about defeating Vladimir Putin? And I would say, well, Vladimir Putin's already outlasted you by 25 years. So I'm here to tell you right now that the only thing that's going to defeat Vladimir Putin is Mother Nature, time. So all we have to do is run out the clock. And if we run out the clock by continuing to prohibit Putin from cleaning house, by allowing enough of the 90s infection to remain in Russia, when Putin goes away, we'll own Russia. Russia will revert back to what we wanted. There won't be another Putin to replace him, and we will control Russia. That's how I would have gone about controlling Russia, to let Russia collapse in on itself after Vladimir Putin left. Instead, what we've done is we've allowed Vladimir Putin to have the opportunity now to transition to a new Russia, one that is totally free of the infection of the 1990s, a Russia that is about the Russian state, not about one man, but about the Russian state. That's the beauty of this election that took place. It wasn't an election for Putin. It was an election for the Russian state. And he is, in the next 6 years, going to make a Russian state that can survive and thrive in a post-Putin era. And he couldn't have done it without this war.
Yeah. No. And everything you said, it just reminded me, on my trip to China, we were on the Korean border, the North Korean border. And one of the ill or forgotten parts of history is that right after China's revolution, the United States invaded Korea, and China sent a couple of million people to fight in that war. And that also, even though China, I think, lost like 200,000 people, it was pretty bloody, they succeeded, and that propelled, if China was already in a place where it was going to change dramatically, that compounding victory and the conditions that spurred it, which is the United States thinking it can just, destroy, take two birds out with one stone, Korea and China, it actually did the exact opposite. And I feel like that's exactly what is happening here. The United States believed that it could take down Russia via this hot point, this flashpoint in Ukraine, and they miscalculated gravely. But Scott, I wanted to talk about the Middle East because there's so much going on with regard to Israel. Right now, there are talks happening over a supposed truce. It's not clear how long it will take for such a thing to come about, but there are reports from the Palestinian side, the resistance side, that Israel is starting to talk about the possibility of a prolonged, if not permanent, restoration of quiet, so to speak, meaning a cessation of hostilities. There are talks from the Palestinian resistance side of Israel withdrawing from certain points, even though the brutality is still occurring. And I don't want to minimize the fact that Israel is still conducting massive war crimes in this genocide. There is this kind of these talks happening. And then there's also this public relations nightmare that's happening in the United States, where you have police forces in New York, where we are located. Many of them are trained actually by Israel, and they are on a rampage, directed and ordered sometimes by state governments, sometimes by these college campuses, to go after protesters on these college campuses, who are calling for divestment in Israel or an end to the genocide. So, Scott, this feels like if we talk about war and politics, as we often do, it feels like a pretty big moment in this horrific war crime and war, this genocide that Israel is committing. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, we have to comment on the fact that we dodged a big bullet the last couple of weeks. There was a real possibility that Iran and Israel could have had a very large extended conflict that would have changed the geopolitical dynamic of what's going on in the Middle East dramatically. We wouldn't be talking about Palestine anymore. We'd be talking about something much different, like global economic catastrophe based upon, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, simultaneous with the closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, energy supplies collapsing, potential permanent damage to energy producing infrastructure in the region. But we're not talking about that because we dodged a bullet. Iran issued a counterattack to the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate on April 1st. On April 14th, Iran counterattacked, and Israel responded with, a very face-saving superficiality. And then both sides said, that's enough. But it's not just that their, deterrence factor had been, redefined. So now Iran had sort of deterrent supremacy over Israel, saying that you can no longer get away with the attacks that you've done in the past. What it did is it set in stone the limits of this conflict, because now in the past, prior to that, everybody was worried about, well, what if this happened, then it could spin out of control and have this broader conflict. Well, what happened here is that we solved this equation by saying there will not be a broader conflict. Nobody will tolerate a broader conflict. The United States made it clear to Israel that we will not stand with you if you attack Iran, and Israel knows that they can't attack Iran unless the United States stands with them. And so we've taken that out, and Iran has said, we are solely focused on getting ready for BRICS and the new economic reality that we want. We don't want a broader war that destroys the economy. So all the major parties have said, we're not doing that. And so what they've done is they went ahead and they capped the upper limit of this conflict, which is bad for Benjamin Netanyahu, because he was always able to operate under, I'm a wartime leader. And if I can't finish Gaza, then I'll go into Lebanon. If it's Lebanon, then I'll go into Iran. But either way, I'm going to come out as the wartime guy, maintain my credibility, maintain my viability, and stay in power. Now you've capped it, which means, frankly speaking, that there isn't going to be a big war with Hezbollah, because that's always been linked to the other big war. So now Hezbollah is just going to be a giant, escalation management scenario where both sides bomb each other more, but it's never going to be allowed to erupt into the big conflict, which means we're back to Gaza. It's all about Gaza. And that forces Netanyahu to, to look at Gaza. What is he going to do? How does he use Gaza as a mechanism to remain relevant? Because Gaza is, sort of the dual epitomes of his defeat. Gaza emerged out of the October 7th failure, and Gaza is in itself a failure of the Israelis because they said they wanted to militarily destroy Hamas, politically destroy Hamas, and they haven't achieved either of those objectives. So the Israelis now are going to start getting into politically creative ways of talking about a forever conflict here, but they have to do it in a way that creates pressure relief valves for the corner they've boxed themselves into. One of the great Hamas victories isn't what's happened on the battlefield, it's what's happened around the world. It's what's happening in Columbia University right now, University of Texas, etc. That Israel has lost global public support. Global public sentiment has been turned decisively against Israel. And this is a very bad thing for Israel. As we speak, the International Criminal Court is on the cusp of issuing arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Gantz and Gallant, the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff. Unprecedented. The International Court of Justice has been condemning Israel for genocidal policies. And the combination of these two means that Israel's lost all credibility in the eyes of the international community. And this is a bad thing. When you have Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, a Democrat who is very close to Israel and AIPAC, saying that Benjamin Netanyahu needs to resign, when you have former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, again, very strong supporter of Israel, saying the same thing, this is bad for Benjamin Netanyahu. He was just threatened by the Minister of National Security, this right-wing guy whose name I can't remember right now, but he lectured Netanyahu, reminding him that he has to go into Rafah or else he's going to lose his coalition. So Netanyahu is in a very, very difficult situation right now, and how is he going to navigate out of this? This is the big question. The United States has put him on notice that should he go into Rafah in a big way, that we will start cutting military aid, and that is the death knell of any prime minister of Israel. If you've screwed up so badly that the United States is cutting military aid, which no American president's been willing to do for a long, long time, then you probably don't deserve to be prime minister anymore, and that's what he's worried about. So the Israelis are going to start coming up with innovative ways to describe the future of the conflict in Gaza. Their end goal is to keep Hamas from resuming its role as political head. They're hoping that they can basically wear the world down and get the world willing to accept a negotiated solution that neuters Hamas as a political entity and then demilitarizes Hamas. Right now, Hamas doesn't seem to be in a position where they're willing to accept either one of those outcomes. And that creates political problems for Netanyahu. Hamas is holding on to more than 130, I guess, hostages, prisoners. And, every day this creates more and more political nightmare for Netanyahu. So it's the Houthi, the Ansarallah movement continues to fire, weapons at shipping, shutting down the port of Elayat. That's costing Israel billions of dollars. Their economy is collapsing. They're politically isolated, etc. So what's happening right now is you're seeing Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, a very desperate man right now, trying to, he's got, every day it seems like people are throwing more. He's trying to juggle all these apples, and people just keep throwing apples at him, and he's got to keep them all in the air. And eventually it's all going to come down, and that'll be the end of Benjamin Netanyahu as the prime minister of Israel.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this moment too is how it has opened up just many avenues for, as you said, a return to focusing on Gaza. You mentioned Iran, which I thought was a very successful retaliation and response to Israel's war crime on its embassy in Syria. Now, last month, and we've spoken about this in the past, Russia met with the Palestinian forces, the various resistance groups that could potentially form some kind of Palestinian national government. And now China, actually, I believe, just over the past day or so, has also been meeting with Hamas, and I believe it was Fatah, holding reconciliation talks. Could you talk about this dynamic here, especially around diplomacy when it comes to Russia's entrance into and China's entrance into this conflict? Because it feels like on this end too, there is interesting developments that speak to Israel's declining status and position in the world, vis-a-vis also the United States' declining position and status in the world.
Well, I mean, Israel used to be able to call the shots. Israel, before the Iranians retaliated, had what was known as deterrence supremacy, meaning that they could pretty much do anything they wanted in the region, and nobody had the courage to strike them back directly. That's where Hamas and other terrorist organizations made their money, because people could provide support to them, and then they would, carry out various terrorist acts. And this was sort of an indirect way of getting revenge for what Israel was doing abroad. But as a state, Israel never suffered an existential threat because everybody was afraid of striking Israel. Saddam Hussein fired 49 missiles against Israel in January and February of 1991 during Operation Desert Storm. A lot of people don't know this, but when the war ended, the Israelis made their top priority the killing of Saddam Hussein. And they actually created plans to accomplish that. And they were prepared to execute those plans in the fall of 1993, when they held a major exercise, a rehearsal for this. I guess Saddam's uncle, Karilla, had died and was going to be buried, and Saddam was going to go up to Tikrit for the funeral outside of the village of Auja. And there was a funeral procession that the Israelis knew about. And so they had already sent in their Sayed Matkal guys. They had reconnoitered the area. They had their ambush site picked. And so they were doing one last rehearsal of the convoy, of the firing sequence, who was going to take out the lead trucks, who was going to kill Saddam, how they were going to disengage, and everything. It was supposed to be a rehearsal without live ammunition, but even the best commandos in the world make mistakes, and Sayed Matkal, instead of having a dummy launcher, had the real launcher, and they fired the missile, and the missile went in, and they hit the car carrying the soldier playing Saddam, killed him, killed a bunch of other Matkal guys, and the extra guys got shut down. And then generals who were in disagreement with this plan leaked it to the press, and that was the end of that. But Israel never forgave Iraq for this. It's one of the reasons why the Israelis changed their assessment in 1999, 2000, about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. I worked with the Israelis for 4 years and got them to admit that Saddam was a rational actor and that Iraq had been fundamentally disarmed. And Iraq fell from the #1 threat to about the #6 or #8 threat. But Israel couldn't forgive Saddam Hussein for the sin of attacking it. So it reversed it, got the United States to go in, bring Saddam down, and get Saddam executed. And the Israelis were very much a part of that execution decision. Why do I mention this? Because if you attack Israel, Israel's policy is you're going to pay an overwhelming price. And everybody knew that Israel was behind this, that this was part of the Israeli policy. And so, if you're Bashar al-Assad and you have missiles and Israel's bombing you, do you send your missiles up against Israel, knowing that Israel now will not rest until you're dead, until your family's dead? No, that's deterrence value. The same thing with the Iranians. Israel assassinates Iranian scientists in Tehran. Israel puts viruses in centrifuges. Israel blows up centrifuge production. Israel attacks Iranian personnel and facilities in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Yemen. But Iran does nothing because Iran is operating under the assumption that if we attack Israel, Israel will come in 10 times as hard. But the Iranians built up a capability, and they changed that deterrence analysis. And so, today, Israel is a nation that no longer has that deterrence supremacy. So now, how do they operate? Where do they go from here? And the answer is that they're going to be looking for a compromise solution in Gaza. What do you need to have a compromise solution? You need to resolve the quandary Israel has created for itself about Hamas is a military organization, Hamas is a political entity. Hamas is winning right now. That's the thing. And if you're winning, you don't give up your strong hands. Hamas isn't going to voluntarily demilitarize. Hamas isn't going to give up politically. And so now, if let's say you're Russia and China, and you just invited Iran and Saudi Arabia to come play ball with you at BRICS. Iran's a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You have grand plans of regional, economic unions, et cetera, that need, viable economies and things moving in. The last thing you need is this war dragging on forever that has the potential of disrupting everything that you're working to do. So you have to come up with a diplomatic solution. And it appears that Russia, based upon their earlier conversations, and China, based upon what's happening now, are trying to bring Hamas and Fatah together. And anybody who knows the history of the Palestinians know that Hamas and Fatah are like oil and water, baby. They just don't mix. They don't like each other. It's not going to happen. But the Israelis have a history of working with Fatah, of working with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian Authority. Now, they've corrupted it thoroughly. One of the benefits of Hamas winning the way they have is that Hamas has a lot of political cards to play. If there was an election today, Hamas would beat Fatah. They would beat Mahmoud Abbas, the president. This is a reality. So Hamas has these cards. Fatah can't ignore them. In fact, if Fatah ignores them, if there's an election, Fatah's out. So the compromise is, how do you get Hamas and Fatah to come together so that Hamas has a meaningful role inside Fatah, but they're not called Hamas anymore? So that when you turn to the Israelis and they say, we demanded that Hamas be eliminated as a political organization, you say, Hamas has dissolved. And the Israelis go, really? Yep, Hamas has dissolved. Well, who's running the show now? We got a new thing called Hamas, or whatever they want to call it, Fatah, Hamas put together. But there's going to be something new, and the United States, Russia, and China will go, that's what you demanded, Israel. You asked for it. You got it. You shut up. We're done with this. And then they're going to say demilitarization. Well, Hamas has won a great military victory. How do you demilitarize? The Qassam brigades disband. And then reform is Fatah. And Fatah 2, Fatah 2.0, whatever, you rebrand them. And so, but the guys who fought, the guys who are the heroes, the guys who are still there, they're in there, they're operating, but they're now part of an umbrella that will become politically acceptable to the Israelis. And so that's what the United States is pressuring Israel to accept. And Russia and China are working to create the compromise, because the United States doesn't have the credibility anymore to sit down with Hamas and Fatah and bring them together. We can't do that. Russia and China can. China, it's interesting. For years, China says they wanted to take a leading role in this. And I remember I started writing papers about this for another entity that I write for. And I remember the pushback from the editorial people. Yeah, China's all talk, no action. China wants to do this, but what credibility does China have? And I'm saying, well, it's China. They're pretty credible. No, but what track record do they have? And then overnight, China negotiates rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I'm like, well, I mean, there you go. China did something that nobody else was able to do. And then, in order to square, because again, these are Western analysts that just can't get it through their head that China is capable of greatness. They're like, yeah, but that really wasn't anything, was it? It was just a flash in the pan. It's not really going to change things, et cetera. And, China still doesn't have the credibility. And now China is probably going to be successful in negotiating, because what China can bring to the table that nobody else can is economic assistance. And when you're looking at Gaza right now, when you're looking at the need to rebuild Gaza, China's the only one that can meaningfully make that happen. And that's a big deal for the Palestinians when talking about the future. And so China is a big player here. And I think China is going to, together with Russia, because Russia has credibility. Russia has been an honest broker all along. So the combination of Russian and Chinese diplomacy, I think, is going to create a compromise solution about the future of Hamas that will assuage Israel politically and begin creating the process for, a political reconciliation, a drawdown on this. Now, how you get from there to a Palestinian state, you can't do that with Benjamin Netanyahu and government. So no matter what, Netanyahu's got to go. And I think he's going to go by, taking a hardline position on whatever Chinese solution there is, and America is finally going to say, we're done with this, and walk away from Netanyahu. And at that point in time, his coalition will collapse, and then there will have to be another governing coalition that understands in order to survive, you have to have America on your side, and they will agree to accept the Russian and Chinese compromise.
I think that's kind of speaks to the optimism despite the carnage that has been wrought on the Palestinian people. And you brought this up, I know, in prior programs too. And you began with this on this topic, the threat of a regional war, the reason why a country like Iran and as well as Russia and China are so keen on keeping that from happening is because it does take away, and it would take away completely from the Palestine question. It would become and it's all about calculation. So if you look at the resistance axis, the axis of resistance, could they, without taking incredible amounts of casualties and losses, could they enact a victory out of a regional war that would then help the Palestinian people? It's likely that such a calculation, I'm going to trust Iran on this because I'm not there and I can't see or experience that, but I'm going to trust them that they have made a calculation that engaging in such a fight would be particularly damaging. But I think it's really interesting, maybe your final word on this, it's really interesting that given all that's happened, even just in the last several weeks, we're having now more discussions about not just Palestine as a question leading to what needs to happen, at least in terms of what true justice is. These people deserve their independence. They deserve a state. They deserve self-determination under international law. But we're also now in this period of just Israel. They've seemingly been just held up militarily. You mentioned it. Hamas has achieved, and the Palestinian resistance forces have achieved this victory militarily by surviving and in many ways keeping Israel at bay. And then you have the fact that the United States, for all of it, we've seen failure after failure after failure to assert any kind of leadership over Israel, over the situation. Now you have Russia and China doing it. And that's really interesting. And Hamas said during these reconciliation talks that they are very pleased with what China is proposing, which is, I think, also a huge deal. So final thoughts on this, Scott?
I think we have to look at, what they call the elephant in the room. We can talk about compromises with Hamas. We can talk about, the brilliant Chinese diplomacy, etc. But at the end of the day, it comes down to a Palestinian state. And how are we going to get to that? And what is that state going to be? When I first started, and I've said this all along, that I'm late to this cause. I'm late to this, to even this issue. I was focused more on arms control, Iran's nuclear program, Israel's military capability, things of that nature. When we speak of the Middle East, the last thing I talked about was Palestinian statehood. Even though I traveled extensively in that region, and I've apologized. I went to a Palestinian community in Tampa, Florida, and apologized to it. And I said, for years, I just didn't see you. I looked past you. You were right there in front of me, but I didn't see you. Well, I see them now, and the whole world sees them now. And now that we see them, we can't ignore them. And is a two-state solution the viable solution? I always fell into the Oslo Accord, fallback position of two-state solution. And I've had people, Eva Bartlett, Eva Bartlett, very very sound analyst and an expert who has lived in Gaza. She has put me in my place more than once, saying that there is no such thing as a two-state solution. It's a one-state solution. It's Palestine, not Israel. And people have said, well, that's impossible because of Israel's dominant position. Israel doesn't have dominant position anymore. I don't think people understand the severity of the wound that Israel has suffered. There's a lot of perceptions that are built into the structure that keeps Israel viable. And one of them is a perception of legitimacy that's born of course, the Holocaust. And, that's one vector of legitimacy. The other one is, biblical legitimacy, the God's chosen people, etc. And then, the perception of Israeli invincibility, that no matter what you thought of Israel, they were here, they're going to be here forever, they can't go away. I don't think Israel has any of those pillars to stand on anymore. The genocide that Israel has been committing against the Gaza people has forever stained the reputation of Israel. Israel needs the support of the world to thrive economically, and part of the land of milk and honey approach that Israel has for Aliyah, the return, is that Israel is a wealthy state, that Israel is a thriving state, that when you come to Israel, you will prosper. And I think the future of Israel going forward is not going to be an Israel of prosperity. I think it's being Israel of a very struggling economy, a shrinking economy. And what you're going to find is that's going to result in a shrinking population as European Jews who went to Israel on the premise that it was going to be the land of milk and honey and perpetual prosperity, now looking at it being anything but, and they're going to start heading home. And if you don't resolve the conflict aspect of this, and you have the potential of renewed conflict with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran hanging over Israel like a sword of Damocles, people are going to say, we don't want that either, and they're going to flee, and you're going to see the great shrinking population. What happens when, as we push forward to even a two-state solution, the question of West Bank settlers has to be resolved? And the only resolution to this is that they have to be determined that they're illegal in their totality, and you have to undo everything that they've done, which is to evacuate these villages, return the land to the Palestinians. And when you do that, you're going to have 400, 500, 600,000 Brooklyn Jews who, came to Israel and to the West Bank and stole this land. They're not going to want to stay in. They didn't come to Israel to work. They didn't come to Israel to toil. They came to steal. They're thieves. They're criminals. They're literally a criminal class of human beings. Brooklyn Jews who went to Israel to steal the land of the Palestinians. And they're going to have to go home to Brooklyn. Now, I'd like to believe the United States passed laws that said that if you stole somebody's property in the West Bank and you and you killed people, murdered them, that you're not welcome here. But no, we'll let them back in. But my point is, people in the next decade, people are going to be fleeing Israel. Israel's going to be shrinking. And this is the key to a solution, because now, as Israel becomes less and less viable, the real question isn't going to be about the maintenance of a Jewish state, but the sustainment of a Jewish presence in the Middle East. And now we're talking a one-state solution. Now we're talking about a situation where Palestinians, Jews, Christians are talking about a single state solution. And this is something that Eva Bartlett and all the real experts of the Middle East and the Palestinian problem say is the only solution. The only solution is a single state solution. But you can't have a single state solution if Israel continues to operate on the lines that they are. And what I'm trying to say is that because of this conflict, over the course of the next decade, you're going to see Israel change demographically, economically, politically, to the detriment of a greater Israel. And there will have to be a need for a compromise. So I'm optimistic on that.
Yeah, certainly. A lot of there's sometimes a knee-jerk reaction from those who have maybe not been open to stepping outside of the box of what we've been told are the possible outcomes of what happens to Palestine, what happens on this question from here on out. But one state solution that protects the rights of all people who currently live in Palestine, that gives Palestine and Palestinians their rights. It doesn't seem so far-fetched anymore, especially with what has transpired. But Scott, I wanted to just talk to you about one more thing briefly, maybe. I just returned from China, and this was right as Antony Blinken was right after Janet Yellen came to China, and then before Antony Blinken came to China. Surprisingly enough, or unsurprisingly enough, nobody was really interested in this diplomacy. At least, there wasn't a lot of optimism among those I was with. But Blinken came and went, and the big, although of course, there's been all this talk about overcapacity in China and sanctions coming on China. There's still this narrative that's being pushed around by the United States of trying to break up Russia and China, that basically targeting China for its so-called support of the conflict, that the United States will take care of it themselves if China does not fix this problem for the United States. Now, Scott, uh, we just talked about Israel's waning legitimacy in terms of its status in the world. The United States appears to be going through this big time as well in parallel. I'm wondering your thoughts about this latest diplomatic game, we could call it, that Blinken and the United States have been playing with China, and with, of course, it always goes back to Russia as well. So your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's reflective of an act of desperation on the part of the United States. We said the same thing to Russia. We're going to sanction you to death. We're going to put on these overwhelming sanctions that are going to collapse your economy. Don't go into Ukraine. It'll be all over. It'll be bad for you. And the sanctions never achieved what they were supposed to. In fact, they backfired. The Chinese a heck of a lot better than I do. I would imagine that China is full of fairly strategic thinkers. What I mean by that is they're not taken by surprise by very much. They consider all options, all possibilities, especially those that are linked to public statements, declaratory policy statements made by potential adversaries like the United States. The notion of American sanctions against China is not a new notion. We have sanctions, active sanctions ongoing against China on a number of fronts right now. But what we haven't done to date is sanction China's financial institutions. In order for this to work, you have to believe that China has extraordinarily fragile financial institutions, and that China's relationship with the world is really built more on eggshells than tempered steel. And that's just not the case. China has been involved in Belt and Roads initiatives, $7 to $10 trillion or more in terms of global investments. They've built up global supply chains that are unmatched. They tap into just about every aspect of the global economy. They have far more global resilience than the United States does. It's not the Chinese yuan or renminbi that's in a global crisis. It's the United States dollar that is. So for Blinken to come in and threaten China is just absurd in the extreme. China is a responsible nation. They have made strategic commitments to Russia, not just in private, but in public. Does Blinken think that he can actually get Xi Jinping to reverse course on publicly stated policy goals and objectives regarding Russia, the strategic relationship between the two? No. And if you take a look at what Russia and China have been doing for the past 2 years, they've been broadening and deepening their economic interaction. We're not going to sanction China into doing anything. The hardest decisions, and we talked about this with Russia, the hardest decisions are those decisions that create pain for you. And so you avoid those decisions because you don't want the pain. Nobody wants to voluntarily suffer pain. But like anything, when you're confronted with the inevitability of the pain, then you adjust to adapt to the pain and get through the pain. That's what Russia had to do with the sanctions that we put on it. China will do the same thing. It's not like China is going to collapse like a house of cards because the United States has threatened sanctions again. First of all, China understands its economy better than the United States, just like Russia understands it. I had to laugh again today at people who I just remember when they were talking about the oil cap and restricting Russian oil. I said to every one of them, I said, I think Russia knows the oil industry, especially the Russian oil industry, and especially how Russian oil industry interfaces with the global oil industry, a hell of a lot better than anybody in your organization. And yet you're out there making proclamations and poo-pooing this. That's Russian propaganda. That's this, that, the other thing. But finally, they had to admit that the price cap has had no effect on the Russians, that the Russians have just built a global ghost fleet of tankers that operates outside of the span of control of Western insurance companies, delivering oil now in a way that can't be monitored by the West effectively. So we have no clue what they're doing. We have no basis upon which to judge anything except the damn Russian economy keeps growing. And I'm here to predict that if we sanction the Chinese, we'll be doing the same thing. The damn Chinese economy keeps growing. It doesn't shrink. What does shrink is us, because the sanctions will backfire on us like we wouldn't believe. The Chinese will put, will turn the tables on us. We'll find ourselves in, with a dollar shortage or a dollar crisis based upon the collapse of global confidence in the dollar. China may dump all the treasuries that they bought. They won't buy up any more debt. We're just literally committing suicide. Instead of, the smartest policy is to say, Russia won in Ukraine. We can't stop it. So let's mitigate the damage. Let's do damage control. Let's contain this beast and pull back and see if we can regroup. But we just keep doubling down on stupid. This is like being at Las Vegas, and I just put my kid's college fund on the table, put it all on red, and it went black. So in my infinite wisdom, I'm taking the mortgage and I'm putting it on the table too, doubling down on stupid. Odds are they're going to take my mortgage too. And that's what the United States is doing. We're just putting everything there. And right now with China, we're playing the sanctions card one more time, one too many times. We're going to bet on the sanctions and they're going to fail. China's just better at this game than we are because we're reacting. The Chinese have been waiting for this. So they have a plan. And you're going to find as soon as we do something, they're going to do what John Boyd, 32nd Boyd of the OODA loop fame. You're familiar with the OODA loop. Boyd, said, if I go head to head with any fighter pilot, I will turn things around and shoot him down by causing him to react to me. So we're going to come in thinking we're in the driver's seat. We're going to put sanctions on, but because China's anticipated the sanctions, they're going to hit us with a move now that has us reacting in a way that we didn't anticipate, and they're going to own the cycle and they're going to win. And that's what's going to happen here if we get into a sanctions-based conflict with China.
Yeah. I mean, in 2023, and this will be ongoing, China's biggest oil supplier was Russia, surpassed Saudi Arabia. That's a byproduct of what the United States and what, of course, its European vassals did to Russia with the sanctions. And you're exactly right, Scott. And China doesn't have to do that much. When I was there and also just reading the materials, and I did this trip, I was around a lot of communists. Oh no, but actually that's who's in the government. That's the government. The Communist Party of China is the government. So I was around a good number of them. And, one of the things that's very stark is that there's a lot of discipline in the policy orientation of the party. The party is the leadership, and whatever policies the party has in place, that's what people follow, and that's what people know. That's what they implement. And what is so interesting, I was in Jilin province, on the Korean border, also borders Russia. And it's quite clear that even in just the last several years, that increased oil trade with Russia has produced enormous opportunities for enhanced investment for this little province. They're the leaders. They're building the high-speed rails. They're building the electric vehicles in large numbers in this very tiny province because, in large part, of the ability to enhance manufacturing through this oil trade, through this partnership with Russia. So this has huge ramifications, and China doesn't even have to do that much. If China is sanctioned, they're going to do what they've been doing, which is investing more, becoming more self-reliant. This is how China's economy is shaking out now. There's all this panic in the Western media about, oh, China's collapsing, its economy is collapsing. If you look at the numbers of where they're investing, it's not collapsing. The tech sector, the renewable energy sector, all of these more innovative, high value added goods, China's growing astronomically in these areas. It's the property sector, already too expensive in China, in many big cities in China, Beijing, Shanghai. That's an intentional thing. If you go there, you'll see that many people are talking about how that's intentional. That's not, oh no, there's some kind of economic disequilibrium. No, they're saying this is too expensive. These companies are running roughshod. We can't have this happen. So we're going to shift where we prioritize. So China doesn't have to do that much. And similarly to almost how Russia, they had thousands of sanctions, certainly make you do a lot. But once the adjustment occurred, now it feels almost like second nature for Russia. So anyway, any final thoughts, Scott?
No, it's I mean, we live in a changing world. I'll just throw this out at the end. I mean, the United States and its infinite desire for creating chaos and anarchy. Just everybody keep an eye on Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, where the United States is seeking to foment a Maidan-style revolution against the Georgian government that's trying to crack down on American soft power coup. There's riots in the street right now. It reminds me very much of what was going on in Kiev back in December 2013, January 2014. This thing could go south real quick. And when I mean south, I mean a civil war, which would be terrible for the Republic of Georgia, terrible for the region. But it's America. I mean, this is what America does. We don't bring peace and prosperity anywhere we go. We bring death and destruction. And the Chinese need to realize that. The whole world needs to realize that. Until America changes the way it does business, the world just needs to treat us like the pariah we are and just stop doing business with us. It may be painful at first, but we don't bring anything to the table. We're not doing anything positive. We just kill people. And right now, America is getting ready to destroy the nation that my wife is from, to destroy the nation that she was born in, that she loves, that her relatives are there. And it's a small nation. It can't afford a conflict like this. A civil war will kill thousands, tens of thousands. And Georgia as a nation can't afford to do this. And so just keep your prayers out there for Georgia, and keep your prayers for the world. I mean, man, I wish my country was behaving better than what it is. It's not good.
Yeah. Well, and that's always the big issue, I feel like. And a lot of people will criticize me and say, "Oh, you're always talking about the United States doing this or that," and I just have to direct them to, well, the United States is doing this or that. The United States is spending all of this money on war. It is, while Israel's committing this genocide, facilitating that, enabling that. Being a party to that, Ukraine, the Asia Pacific. I mean, all of these conflicts could lead to the big conflict that we all, I know we both share a deep commitment to preventing, because of how catastrophic. I mean, it would be. And you said it on this show. That would be it. Game over humanity. Like that is what, at bare minimum, we should be committed to stopping. And so we're in an election year. I feel like we're always in an election year, but our choices are in the mainstream two-party system are what they are. And we are on a kind of a collision course of the world is changing, I believe, for the positive. And the real threat here is the United States, and of course all of its hangers on, how they respond, how it responds to all of this. And so far it has not been good. So far it is definitely
I'm with you, Dan. I'm the most patriotic guy in the world. I mean, I love my country, but I'm also very honest. If there was something, trust me on this one, if there was something that I could wrap myself in the flag and walk around going USA, USA, USA legitimately, I'd be the first one to do it. I'm damn proud. I'm more than happy to walk around and pump my fist and praise my country, but give me something to praise. For all the people that are out there, they keep going, you're pro-Russian. Not pro-Russian, I'm pro-American. But I take a look at the Russian-American equation, and I'm going, the only guy that's trying to actually solve problems is Putin. You know, if you don't want me to be saying good things about Putin, give me better things to say about America. Give me something to say about America. All right. My goal is to create the conditions for peace between the United States and Russia. But if Russia is the only one that's putting anything out there on the table, then I'm going to take advantage of that right now, not because I'm pro-Russian or because I'm leaning towards Russia. It's because that's the indirect approach to improve things for my country. God, if my country could take the lead on that, I'd be on that board. I'd be moving that direction. I want to be behind my country. I want to be working with my country. But we got nothing right now, Danny. We got nothing. And that's the sad fact. And so, yeah, I'm very critical of my country, not because I want to be critical. I want to say nice things. I want to praise my country. But my God, please give me something to say. And if you can't, then don't condemn me for pointing out the harsh truth that the Russians are doing it better than we are right now.
Yeah, and I apologize for keeping you longer. It's just I don't know if I'll get another chance to say this for a bit. So, I've been seeing that there's been cynicism about the college student encampments, protests regarding the Gaza genocide. I've also, to your point, it's quite clear that when it comes to the United States, of course, there's a difference between people and the government and the system. But in terms of what's positive right now, these encampments and the changes in opinions on things like Gaza and all of this activity, that's very positive. I think where the problem resides for me is we still feel very far away from that leading to a significant political change that can lead to a widespread change in the way the United States conducts itself. Both at home and abroad. We got a lot of. I know you talk a lot of problems here in the United States. We have a lot of powerful people who do very, very awful things to vulnerable people, and of course that goes without saying when it comes to foreign policy. So, for all of the positive, and I think people are moving in a good direction in the main. It's the fact that there is still this systemic problem, this fact that those who control the levers of power, they are not taking the United States in a good direction. They're taking the United States in a suicidal direction because the United States' approach right now to foreign policy is what looks like to be an attempt to maintain hegemony and expand influence and all of this. But the results are far from that. The results are the opposite. And while that's not, I don't cry, or I think the United States needs to be what I was told when I went to China in July. The United States needs to be another country. I believe that wholeheartedly, but it's the impact of U.S. foreign policy on both the world and both people at home that is the big problem, because it's catastrophic, and we're seeing that play out over and over. So I just needed to say that. If you have any final, I like to close with you, Scott. So if you have any final thoughts, we can then end here.
Well, I'll try and come up with something positive here. When I went to college, Franklin Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, graduated in 1984, stepped on the campus for the first time in 1981. There was a tree down by the student, the main faculty building, the president's building, all this stuff. It was called the, I think it's a demonstration tree or something, but it was a place where during the Vietnam War, students would go up and post the assemblies, takeovers, things like that. And our professors, because I was there in the 80s, so many of the professors there that were nearing retirement were professors during the Vietnam War period, and they spoke of the activism of the students. And I remember one professor walked me to the tree and showed me the tree and showed me the nails, and he explained the history of each one of these nails and how it related to student activism and how he had felt so encouraged and empowered by the students believing in something so much that they would actually go forth and demonstrate in favor of that. My generation We didn't do any damn protests. We basically drank beer, played football, went to frat parties, graduated, and some mixture of that in between for everybody. There were no big demonstrations. I mean, there was politically active people, but it was flash in the pan, and that I became very jaundiced with college students over the years. I just thought that because I've spoken at a lot of universities and I've seen, especially remember during the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I mean, I was everywhere. I went all over the world to university campuses. I spoke to stadiums full of thousands of students, and not a damn thing happened. We went to war, and then it all went away. There was no accountability, and I just gave up on it. I got to tell you, Danny, I'm pretty impressed right now, because what's happening on these campuses, it's not just one campus. It's the entire damn student body in America waking up and saying no to something, saying no to bad policy. And the government came down hard on these guys. I mean, the police brutality, the violence, etc. And it ain't going away. The students are doubling down. They're coming in. They're outflanking. It's expanding. This is an awakening of what universities are supposed to be, because I see a lot of people say, why aren't they in the classroom? It is the damn classroom. It's called the classroom of civic responsibility. It's called the classroom of citizenship. These are students who actually have opened their minds and their hearts, and they see a great wrong, and they're trying to right the wrong only the way that they can, through demonstrations. It's what American campuses, to be honest, should be doing. And I'd prefer they were in the classroom, but when you have something like this, the students are sort of the conscience of a nation, because the rest of us are locked into our existence. We go to jobs, we get torn down with paying taxes. The students are the last free liberated class in America, because they don't have a damn thing to worry about. They've either bankrupted themselves by taking loans, or mama and papa bankrupted themselves to pay for their colleges, but they're in college, baby. Tuition's paid for. They got it. They got 4 years to sit there and become good citizens, become educated citizens, to learn about the world. And they're out there doing great things right now. God bless the American students, because they're out there, they're taking a stand, and they're showing us, leading by example. So I want to leave with that positive aspect of it right now. I'm behind the students 110%, not because I agree with everything they say. I don't. But I agree with the passion they bring to this. It's the passion that I want every American to have about something. I want every American to be this passionate about something in their lives. Passionate about peace, passionate about nuclear disarmament, passionate about the Palestinian people, passionate about being opposed to Israeli genocide. Be passionate about something. So look at these students, applaud these students, support these students, be like these students.
Indeed. I mean, that's so well put. I've seen so many quibbles, so many, even from people who I would consider to be in the interests of peace and really, there's a lot of cynicism out there. There's a lot of suspicion for those of us who are always studying the nefarious activities of the powerful. But at the same time, with these students and what they're doing, look, I've been a leftist all my life, or at least all my political life, that I count. I know what it could be to just find something to disagree with. I mean, I've dropped this mainly in my life now, but find something you disagree with and just focus on that.